Following the Second World War and especially the Korean War, two blocs were facing off, specifically in Europe. In the east you had the Warsaw Pact, and in the west you had NATO. Now amongst NATO there were some that dreamt that a whole NATO force could be equipped with the same sort of vehicles, the same sort of calibers, the same sort of radio sets, and the same sort of aircraft. Now this was eventually not to be, but today's special guest features as one of the early attempts to develop a concept of an aircraft that would be used by everyone, the Fiat G.91. Hello everyone and welcome back to Military Aviation History. I'm your host Bismarck, and today we are in Berlin-Gatow at the Militärhistorische Museum of the Bundeswehr. When Germany was divided in East and West during the Cold War, it wasn't long until both sides were remilitarized by their respective guardians. In the West, the new Luftwaffe was established in 1956. Rebuilt in parallel to the development of today's guest, the two would soon become an inseparable picture. When the Korean War ended in 1953, the jet had emerged as the new status quo in the sky. It had given all participants plenty of food for thought. Not only was it clear that jet development had to be continuously pushed forward, but it was clear that a tactical support role for aircraft remained as important as ever. Considering that the Soviet Union and the West were locked in this standoff, Western nations decided that complete demilitarization was probably not on the table for so far. Considering the vast pool of engineers and aviation experts in the various Western countries, NATO decided to push forward with the first attempt of a standardized aircraft that could and should be used by the main Western powers. Mutual experience and use of the same plane was considered to be complementary to operational needs, from logistics to, well, tactical flexibility. In order to start such a project and not overload it with unnecessary details, the simplest of designs was chosen: a low-altitude fighter jet aircraft with tactical strike potential, flying at Mach 0.9 and to be used from improvised airfields. Following the 1953 announcement of SHAPE, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Nations Europe, various designs were proposed. Yet the design, as simple as it sounded, wasn't. The world had just only seen the onset of modern post-World War II jet aviation, from the American F-86 Sabre over to the MiG-15. There was a lot of brain power, but still a lack of fundamental expertise when it came to jets. Supplied to the decision-making board were various aircraft from all over Europe: the British Berlin-Gatow, the French Berlin-Gatow, and the Dassault Étendard, as well as the Italian Sagittario II. The competition was quite fierce. And as the prototypes were being built, another contender entered the fray. This one came from the famous Italian aeronautical engineer Giuseppe Gabrielli. You might actually remember his name. He is the one who designed the World War II Fiat G50 and G55. He has also been the man behind the first Italian jet, the G80. Gabrielli had only a few months to pen out his design, and he knew that he had to make the best out of the time he was given. And knowing that NATO was primarily influenced by the US, of course, and that the current Western standout fighter was more or less still the F-86 Sabre, he took that design, scaled it down, and put his own flair to it before he sent it off. Now that sounds simple, and that is how the story is often told, but I don't think that's giving him enough credit, especially not the credit he actually deserves. His design was not a simple Sabre knockoff. If anything, it was a clear refinement. It had many clever ideas and characteristics worked into it, to the point where, yeah, it stands on its own legs. The initial design was extremely light, around 2 tons, which is 3 tons lighter than the Sabre and actually puts it closer to a mid-sized car of the time than the F-86. It also had a clear design philosophy. Gabriele, in collaboration with his contacts in the army, of course he knew that if the Cold War ever got hot, there would be no clean operational conditions. Italy was vulnerable from the east and its air force would be forced to conduct continuous tactical strikes, operating under immense pressure from a numerically superior force, most likely from airfields that were on the direct attack or in fact improvised. Perhaps the Italians actually here remembered the Eastern Front experience of the Axis power when they penned out this design. Thus Gabriele designed his aircraft to operate from short runways, one that might actually suffer quite heavily from enemy artillery or bombardment, thus requiring a far stronger gear as the aircraft is forced to thread over uneven ground with hastily filled in holes. This robust short-filled capability seemed perfectly sorted for the sort of messy and intense conflict a full-scale war would provide. The construction of the plane was simple too. 3 sections built in an all-metal semi-monocoque fashion. The front section, in fact, was housing all the electrical radar and navigational equipment, of course, but it was only bolted to the main frame and could be removed quite easily. As well as that, once built, the prototype convinced the Giorgio with its cockpit layout, its light and balance controls, its stability and maneuverability in flight. In fact, an early pilot remarked that the new design, known as the Fiat G.91, reminded him of flying the American P-38. Convinced that they had found the winner, the G.91 was chosen by NATO in June 1955. As the aircraft was put through its paces, various changes of course occurred. First off, the weight increased by the substantial 400 kilograms, mainly due to the strengthening of the airframe and the new engine, which was a British Bristol Orpheus BR-1 turbojet, delivering 4,000 pounds of static thrust. This was just the kind of jump and kind of oomph you wanted around this time, considering that the plane was not supposed to go supersonic. High-speed tests did highlight some issues, however, especially with one test pilot actually having to eject in 56 after developing troubles with the tail control. As a NATO project, the Italians were able to submit their tail design to NACA in the US for wind tunneling testing to obtain actually quite a considerable amount of data. And the results there would be delivered to them at home and changes were made. The second prototype with the changes to the tailplane flew then in the mid-1957. The delay that the first accident caused wasn't ideal, but at least now an upgraded version of the engine could be added, and this delivered an additional 800 pounds of thrust. At this point, fixed weapon trials were also conducted, flying with either 4 50 cals holding 600 rounds each, or 2 20mm cannons with 200 rounds each, or in fact 30mm cannons, 2 of those with 120 shells each. Now the guns were also given easy access so that you could accelerate turnaround time. However, what we see here are 4 muzzles. Well, we see 2, but mirrored of course 4. All the documentation I have looked at is that the Fiat G.91 that the Germans used was only equipped with 2 30mm cannons. So this either means that the aircraft's nose was modular, so that you could swap it out either with 50 cals, or in fact there's something wrong in my documentation and the Germans actually received 50 cals as well. Something tells me that it might have been the former and that this was just a modular design. As a tactical strike aircraft, the Fiat could be armed with a mixture of weaponry, either bombs or rockets. Rockets seem to have been preferred in the configuration that we have right here inside a pod. Italy itself had put a pre-production series of 27 aircraft on order, immediately followed by 48 production aircraft designated R1 and R1A. 50 R1Bs followed, built with a stronger engine to provide more power. This is the one with 800 pounds of extra thrust. Now there is also a trainer version with the suffix T, and there were a few supersonic versions, at least experimental versions initially, powered with 2 General Electric J.87s. 65 of those were built in eventually known as the G.91Y. Furthermore, the aircraft is then also used by the Italian acrobatics team. You remember that I noted that the aircraft was chosen in 1955 as part of the 1953 NATO competition. Now in 1958, after 5 years, it was ready. Were there any takers among the nations that have participated? Well, no. When their design wasn't chosen, their own design, France and Britain decided not to wait around to see what the Italians came up with. After all, they had submitted their own designs based mainly around, well, their own requirements, and had put those into production in the meantime. The Brits, for example, had the Gnant, and the French had the Étendard. You'll know that even nowadays, standardization among, well, NATO countries is not what it could be, and many different collaborative schemes ended in failure. This one of the first of its kind, was launched in the 1950s. The idea of pooling resources and adopting foreign designs based on a unified vision was a foreign concept. As time went by, things changed, but the big two in Europe of the time, France and Britain, had their own priorities. France had just re-energized their own aviation industry in a spectacular fashion, of course exemplified with the Mirage 3. And Britain was, in essence, the European powerhouse of jet aircraft. In that light, it's not surprising that they adopt their own designs and not something Italian, especially as this design didn't seem to fit into their national conception of what defense against the Soviets would look like. But there was one country that looked at the Fiat G.91 with interest: West Germany. And I think we can see why. On the one hand side, it still had to set out its own industry. And on the other hand, the experiences on the Eastern Front had fundamentally shaped the German idea of how total war with the Soviet Union would look like. They knew, well, from first-hand experience, how dire the logistical situation could become, how improvised the airfields were, and how constant, unceasing and intense the fighting was. A simple, lightweight aircraft with a strong, robust airframe, a good gear, and a tactical strike potential. Well, put on a pot of sauerkraut, we've got a winner. This R3 then was based on the R1B, and roughly 400 planes were built for West Germany. 50 additional planes were built for Greece and Turkey, but they weren't delivered and actually introduced into the Luftwaffe, but soon enough given to Portugal. Now, when it comes to the Fiat, the Germans really weren't playing around. They too opted for the 30mm armament and installed an additional second pylon for drop tanks or ordnance on each wing. Now, the Bendix Doppler radar system was added as well, and the positioning and homing indicators were also given to the pilot to assist navigation. There was even a small-scale SATS trial, that's Short Airfield and Tactical Support, designed by the US Marine Corps. In its application, the G.91 was slotted to be a fighter, a tactical strike aircraft and a reconnaissance asset for the Luftwaffe, introduced into the Aufklärungs- und leichte Kampfgeschwader. The theory dictated that essentially the aircraft would, by simple necessity, be close to the front line. Somewhere between, well, 150 to 300 kilometers from the fighting, the G.91 would take off, climb to 1,000 meters, cruise towards the enemy, and once close, go to max speed and attack its target. Or in fact, it could loiter around for 10 to 20 minutes. Once it has hit its target, it was meant to get the hell out of Dodge and escape on full power until clear of the AO. Then, of course, cruise back to the airfield, rinse and repeat. It's not fancy, but it gets the job done. Now, after all that, let's take a closer look at this ex-Luftwaffe aircraft found here in Berlin. The aircraft is compact, 10.3 meters long, it spans 8.5 meters and it stands at 4 meters. The G.91 carries a single Bristol Sydney Orpheus 803 turbojet, giving it a static thrust of around about 5,000 pounds. This propels the aircraft at a maximum speed of 1,100 kilometers an hour. Empty weight is around 3,000 kilograms with a maximum loaded weight of 5,500 kilograms. It carries two 30mm Defa cannons, and the Fiat G.91 is of course heavily armed for the time with that loadout. However, the cannons only have 120 rounds. You will also notice the 4 hard points under the wings. Well, you will see one here, and there should be another one right there. This is of course a Luftwaffe conversion, and a plethora of equipment could be carried. Drop tanks for increased range, bombs to go boom, and rockets to strike a specific target. These would generally be dumbfire rockets. There weren't missiles, air-to-ground missiles available yet at the time, but you know, a mixture of rocket pods, anything from, well, 15, 19 or 25 rockets per pod, something like that. So we are going to be jumping into a trainer version, but the cockpits are just as they would be in a real one. So once you're sitting inside, it is actually relatively comfortable. I've got ample of leg room, I've got ample of arm and elbow room. The only thing that is fairly obvious at this point is that the chair that I'm sitting in, the Martin Baker, seems to be way too small. This is me sitting in a sort of normal stance. So I just climbed into the back since the headrest is actually raised on this seat, and all I can say, now I'm sitting perfectly in this aircraft, and it's so comfortable you wouldn't believe it. Probably one of the most comfortable planes I've ever sat in. Now we're starting again on the left hand side, working our way through over the instrument board to the right hand side. Most of it is fairly generic, but there are one or two things here that do stand out. First of all, what we could say about this aircraft is that the instrument board in front does appear to be a little bit cluttered. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of very small dials as well, which is a little bit surprising. Then again, this is of course a transformational sort of time period. Starting all the way on the left hand side, now this is slightly different in the trainer version that I have here and the actual aircraft that would be used on frontline service, because of the implementation of an intercom which sits between the normal communications console and the weapon system control panel right here. Because of this, things look a little bit different. But all the buttons and all the levers are here. You've got your weapon controls, you've got of course the intercom, you have your trim control and your emergency longitudinal trim just to the left of that, and then you have your communications panel in front of it. Then we come to the throttle. Now the throttle, as you'd expect, just a generic push and pull to open and close. The speed brakes are worked into the actual handle, as well the ignition, as well as the microphone. So if you want to talk, there you go. The flap controls is just to the left. There's actually a little plastic bar here, which I'm not sure if this is actually as per specs when the aircraft rolls out, but there seems to be some sort of installation here that prevents you from hitting the flap control when you're operating the throttle, perhaps with your big gloves or something. But there we go. Moving up front, we have the starter units and the system units for the actual engine, fuel booster pumps and all that good stuff. Bottom left there, our taxi and navigational lights, as well as the indicators for gear up locked or down locked. The gear lever is just on top of that. That is a very prominent red lever there. Just to the right of that, we have the drag chute. This is currently in the pole position. Actually a nice little design implement there. They actually have a little chute emblem on the drag chute level there. That's kind of cute, I guess. Okay, coming forward then to the actual dashboard. We have the speed counter and the Mach counter integrated into one. We have your altitude, you have your position and homing indicator right in the middle. You have another directional compass, and below that you have your wind adjustment. To the right of that we come to the small dials. We have your flap indicator, at what percentage they're extended, what angle. We also have a turn and slip indication light there. We have your hydraulic pressure to below that. The camera control below that in the central pedestal. Moving onwards from the center, from top, we have an attitude indicator, we have got your variometer, we've got a clock. Then we've got the warning lights for the oil and fuel pressure. We've got your engine RPMs, of course. We've got the temperature in the engine. We've got your fuel supply, as well as a accelerometer, giving you essentially your acceleration. Now, I gotta say that quite a few of these dials, from the position that I'm in, I can't properly read them. But this is just a question of perspective coming from here. If I would be slower down, no problem at all. Moving over to the right then, We've got your control for the batteries and the generators. We've got your oxygen regulator. We've got the tack hand control, console lighting. You've got your NCU. You've got your tack hand control once again. We've got a radar system here. We've got the cockpit, quality of life improvements, cockpit air temperature and all that good stuff. And going over, then we have the thrust lever right here. And then, of course, we have the circuit breaker. Up front, we have the emergency external stores release. That would be anything that is stored on the pylons, whether it be, well, a drop tank or a bomb. And then we also have the emergency wheel brake to the right. The gun sight itself seems to be a French model, and it's a very simple design, something very reminiscent from what we had in World War II, essentially. You can also adjust the brightness here quite easily on a nice little big knob, and you can make minute adjustments on the flywheels right there. The stick itself is of a very generic design. We've got your trim switch. You have your bomb, rocket and drop tank release right here, depending on what you've selected. Front is of course for the guns or for the camera. And then we have an extra switch on the bottom, just firing the camera. So yeah, that rounds us up on the cockpit side. Sitting in here for a little bit longer, I gotta say I'm still very, very comfortable. I guess this is just, the Italian thing. They know how to make things in such a way that you really, really enjoy sitting in them. Once inside though, I gotta say it does seem a little bit cluttered. It is very much a representation of its time. While the Fiat G.91 did not have the success one would have anticipated from winning a NATO competition, its light attack nature did fit the conceptions of the two major nations holding the front line in Europe. Sorry, Austria. In fact, actually, had Austria adopted the aircraft which they had considered at one point, it would have been one clean line of G91s all the way from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. What is interesting from perhaps a modern perspective, of course, is that some nations have recently, essentially we're talking about the United States here, but have recently gone back to the idea of a light attack aircraft for certain mission types and conflicts. While in the US, with the exclusion of the Textron Scorpion in 2018, turboprops instead of jets seem to be in fashion at the moment, we can see some striking parallels between contemporary aircraft and this Italian beauty from the 1950s. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed it, please consider supporting the channel by sharing this video, liking it and subscribing, and also checking out our Patreon page linked below. If you'd like to visit the Militärhistorische Museum Berlin-Gatow, check out the link down below, and as always, have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.